Because of government restrictions, some passages of this program are voiced by actors and have been subtitled.
In the mid-1970s, the British government set out new policies for dealing with the chaos and violence that had engulfed Northern Ireland. Amongst them was the policy of criminalisation, which would deny that Republican or Loyalist paramilitary groups were acting with political motivations. Paramilitary prisoners, many convicted of bombing attacks or murder, would be stripped of special category status and treated instead as ordinary decent criminals. To facilitate this, a purpose-built cellular prison was hastily constructed on the grounds of a disused RAF base to house newly convicted prisoners. Designed as the most modern and most secure prison in Europe, the wardens and staff were given unprecedented powers to break resistance to the criminalisation policy. Prisoners responded by smearing excrement on the walls of their cells, starving themselves to death, and leading the largest escape in Europe since the Second World War, from a facility that became famous for inhumane treatment and security failures. Welcome, my friends, to Her Majesty's Prison Maze. From August 1971, the Nissan Hut compounds of Lankesh, a former World War II RAF base outside Lisburn, were used to house hundreds of detainees imprisoned without trial after the introduction of internment. Following a hunger strike in 1972, paramilitary prisoners were granted special category status, meaning they no longer had to wear prison uniforms or do prison work, and they could segregate themselves into compounds based on their paramilitary affiliation. Here they conducted weapons training and political education, and operated on a strict military hierarchy with little to no interference from the prison staff. In January 1975, the Gardiner Committee, set up to consider measures to deal with terrorism in Northern Ireland, reported that the granting of special category status had been a mistake and should be withdrawn as soon as possible. It effectively recognised that Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries had political motivations for their actions and legitimised their campaigns. The government accepted the recommendation and declared that special category status would end after the 1st of March 1976. From then on, paramilitary prisoners would be treated as normal members of the prison population, required to wear prison uniform and conform to prison discipline. The Nissan huts of Lankesh were unsuited for carrying out this new policy, and so in the summer of 1975, construction of a cellular prison adjoining the compounds began. Taking its name from a local townland, Unmo, meaning the plain, Her Majesty's Prison Maze was built hastily in phases, eventually numbering 8 cellular blocks, from which it took its nickname, the H-blocks. The legs of each H-block were split into 2 self-contained wings, with 24 single cells and 1 double cell. The rectangular body of each H-block, which contained the control room and block administration, was awkwardly known as the Circle, in reference to Victorian-era prisons. Each block was fenced off from the rest of the prison, and watchtowers manned by British soldiers covered each yard of each wing, as well as the gates between the various phases and the external perimeter. It's not for nothing that the maze was described as a prison within an army camp. The end of special category status was deeply resented by the Provisional Irish Republican Army, which insisted its members were taking part in a politically motivated military struggle. As the main reason for the withdrawal of special category status was to deny the IRA legitimacy and a political justification for their actions, the stage was set for confrontation from the get-go. A month after the March cut-off point, Patrick Dillon was shot dead outside his house. He would be the first of 6 prison officers to be killed by the IRA over the next year. On the 14th of September 1976, Kevin Nugent, the first IRA volunteer to be convicted after the end of special category status, arrived at the maze. When presented with his prison uniform, Nugent refused to wear it on the grounds that he was a political prisoner, later saying that if they wanted him to wear it, they would have to nail it to his back. Stripped, beaten and dragged naked to his cell, Nugent draped himself in a blanket, and by January, some 40 prisoners housed in H2 had joined what would become known as the Blanket Protest. Initially, these non-conforming prisoners were allowed to wear their blankets in the yard, but this concession was withdrawn, and they were ordered to wear their uniforms or exercise naked. Refusing both options, they remained confined to their cells for almost 24 hours a day, leaving only to wash themselves. As the number of prisoners joining the blanket protest continued to rise throughout 1977, many prison officers, angered at the killing of their comrades and with orders to break the protest, began to brutalise the naked prisoners. Subjected to systematic beatings and verbal abuse, complaints to authorities usually resulted in more beatings, often carried out in the presence of senior prison officers or even block governors. To protest, from the end of March 1978, Republican prisoners refused to leave their cells at all, even to slop out their chamber pots into a bucket beside the cell door. By the summer of 1978, up to 300 prisoners in H3, H4 and H5 were taking part in what had come to be known as the Dirty Protest. 2 men were now held in each cell with only their blankets, their chamber pots and their mattresses, pieces of which they would break off to smear their excrement on the walls to mitigate the spread of maggots. After pouring their urine under the cell door, they would build a dam out of rotten food to stop it from flowing back in. As the Dirty Protest went on, staff began to force wash the prisoners, dragging them from their cells, dumping them into baths of disinfectant and scrubbing them down with a deck brush, tearing open their skin. Prisoners had clumps of their scalp ripped out when they were forcefully shaved, and beatings were administered throughout the process. Initially, cells were hosed down every night, but as the protest grew, wing shifts were introduced. One wing of each block was kept empty by doubling up the number of prisoners in the others. Once a week, an entire protesting wing would be moved here, while an external cleaning crew in hazmat suits hosed down their cells. Prisoners would be kicked, punched and beaten as they were taken to and from the empty wing. Returned to their cells immediately after they had been cleaned, the fumes from the heavy disinfectants used created an effect like CS gas, stinging their eyes and causing them difficulty in breathing. As the prisoners were required to wear uniforms to attend visits, many of those on the Dirty Protest had gone over a year and a half without contact from the outside world. From March of 1978, some prisoners wore uniforms to attend visits so that they could highlight the ongoing conditions and smuggle contraband. Often on these visits, the prisoners would be met by a female volunteer, posing as their girlfriend. Sharing a long kiss, the prisoner would push comms, tiny handwritten notes for the external leadership, into the visitor's mouth, who in turn pushed comms for the internal command, and other contraband, such as tobacco and writing supplies, to the prisoner. Without attracting the attention of the prison guards, these would then need to be hidden about their body. One prisoner is said to have set a record by carrying 40 cigarette papers in his foreskin. Tiny crystal radios were also smuggled into the maze so the prisoners could get news from the outside. To prevent prison staff finding them, they would be lubricated in butter and hidden in a prisoner's rectum when not in use. Tobacco, writing supplies, and other contraband such as sweets were wrapped in cling film and also hidden by prisoners in their rectums, with one prisoner earning the nickname the Suitcase for his legendary carrying capacity. The guards carried out invasive searches of the prisoners in an attempt to combat the smuggling of contraband, and in some wings, cell 26 was used for this purpose, becoming known as the Romper Room. Here, 2 officers would force a prisoner to squat naked over a mirror, while another would shine a torch on it, and engage in what came to be known as stargazing. Though locked in their cells for 24 hours a day, the prisoners established a wide-ranging communication network by taking advantage of the structural and procedural flaws of the H-blocks. Prisoners could push comms and cigarettes through a small aperture in the heating pipes that ran through the cells, allowing for full communication along each side of the wing. They would take a button from the uniform that was left in their cell and tie it to one end of a long string pulled from their blanket. To the other end they would tie a comm or a cigarette and, lying on the floor, flicked the button to the cell across from them. Communication beyond the wing was handled by a scorcher, derived from the Irish word scart, a shout. The scorcher's job was to shout information to a nearby wing or block. This shouting and the flicking of buttons across the hallway was facilitated by the absence of prison staff for much of the day. They came on the wing at 7:30 in the morning and left at 8:30 in the evening, as well as for an hour for tea in the middle of the day. When the staff departed, prisoners would stand at the locked doors of their cells to hold conversations, tell stories, or even sing songs during concerts, which were aimed at reinforcing the sense of comradeship between the men and bolstering morale. Irish language classes were also carried out during these periods, led by the most fluent speaker on the wing. They would call out words and give their spelling, which prisoners would scratch onto the walls, often with the end of an empty tube of toothpaste. As well as passing time and fostering a cultural identity that strengthened a prisoner's determination to continue with the protest, there was also practical reasons for teaching Irish. The staff couldn't understand it. In February of 1979, 2 months after the IRA killed the deputy governor of the Maze prison, a concentrated effort was made to break the protest. The IRA's internal prison leadership was identified and moved to a clean wing in H6 to isolate them, while violence against those in the protesting blocks escalated. Beatings and cavity searches became regular, especially in H3, where the youngest prisoners were held, some just 16 years of age. Food was also tampered with. A priest visiting the protesters found a guard urinating into the tea urn, and the prisoners' dinners would be spat on, sprayed with fly killer, or would have maggots put in them. By the middle of 1980, the prisoners in the protesting blocks had been living in subhuman conditions for over 4 years. Though they were committed to continuing, there was no end in sight, and the numbers joining the protest had fallen off. Cardinal Mosso Fee had been conducting secret negotiations on behalf of the prisoners with the British government, but they believed the protest was running out of steam and had little interest in compromising. Feeling that something had to be done to force the matter, 7 prisoners went on hunger strike from the 27th of October 1980. The strike was led by Brendan Hughes, and as per protocol, he was replaced by Bobby Sands as officer commanding the IRA in the Maze. The prisoners outlined 5 demands for bringing the hunger strike and the dirty protest to an end, including the right not to wear prison uniform and the right not to do prison work. In support of the hunger strike, 200 previously conforming prisoners joined the dirty protest and were moved to H3, stretching its capacity to the limit. In December, 3 female prisoners at Armagh Jail went on hunger strike, and 6 members of the Ulster Defence Association held in the Maze, who also wanted the same rights as the Republicans, briefly joined before being ordered off by their external command. High-level negotiations were held in secret between the prisoners and the British government, and on the 18th of December, Hughes was led to believe that an acceptable compromise was being delivered to the prison. After 53 days without food, one of the strikers, Sean McKenna, was near death, and Hughes took the decision to call off the strike before the offer arrived so that he could get medical treatment. Controversy still surrounds what happened next. Republicans claim that the British switched out the document containing the concessions because what arrived later was nothing more than a reaffirmation that there would be no change to the prison regime. Outside the prison, the IRA ordered celebrations to be held to give the impression of victory, but inside the Maze, morale collapsed. The prisoners who had recently joined the dirty protest returned to their conforming wings, and there were even discussions on bringing the protest to an end. With very few options left, and believing that they had learned from the failure of the first one, the prison leadership decided on a second hunger strike. On the 1st of March 1981, the 5th anniversary of the withdrawal of special category status, Bobby Sands refused food and declared that he was on hunger strike. The next day, the dirty protest was ended to allow full attention to be focused on the strike, and prisoners took showers, shaved, and saw their reflections in a mirror for the first time in over 3 years. 3 more prisoners joined Sands at staggered intervals over the next few days, and after this, prisoners would be replaced as they died. By the end of April, the hunger strikers were moved to the prison hospital to be kept under 24-hour medical observation. As they grew weaker, they were given waterbeds and sheepskin rugs to sleep on to protect their skin, and they were turned every 2 hours to prevent bedsores. Towards the end, their eyelids would have become so thin that they couldn't keep the light out when they shut them, and even breathing caused them pain. Sands, who had been recently elected to Westminster, was the first hunger striker to die on the 5th of May after 66 days without food. His death sparked off several days of rioting and violence in Northern Ireland, and his funeral was attended by over 100,000 mourners. 9 more men, all of them aged between 23 and 29 years of age, would die before the hunger strike was called off. By September, the hunger strike began to break down in confusion. IRA volunteers withdrew their names, and the Irish National Liberation Army, who had lost 3 members, indicated that they would not be putting forward any more. In a number of cases, families intervened to take their sons off the strike as they fell unconscious. With no clear directions from the external leadership, the hunger strike was officially ended on the 3rd of October 1981. Happy to have faced down 2 such challenges, the British moved to make sure that there wouldn't be another, and began to implement moderate reforms. Within 3 days, all prisoners in jails throughout Northern Ireland were given their own clothes to wear. Attempts to get the prisoners to do work were abandoned after the constant sabotage of expensive workshop equipment, and within a few years, the majority of the 5 demands had been granted. Since the withdrawal of special category status in March of 1976, the IRA had killed 18 serving prison staff, a retired prison officer, and his wife. By 1983, prisoners had total control of their wings, moving about freely through most of the day with little interference from the prison staff. As well as carrying out their own educational classes, this allowed prisoners in H7 to plan an escape. When a prison officer returned to H7 after a lengthy absence, he was shocked to find high-ranking members of the IRA's prison command working in the circle as orderlies, mopping and polishing the floors, making tea for the staff, discussing football results, and helping them with their crossword puzzles. The staff were convinced that the prisoners had been broken, but in reality they were being manipulated. Staff became accustomed to their presence in the circle, doing odd jobs from where they could watch and learn its procedure. It was even common to see prisoners hanging around the locked grille to the control room, the very heart of the block. A larger, solid door was supposed to be locked over this, but as there was no air conditioning in the control room, this was usually left open. Prisoners would pass in cups of tea, talk to the officer on duty, and learn as much as they could about how the room functioned. At 2:30 p.m. on Sunday, the 3rd of October 1983, Brendan McFarlane, Bobby Story, Jerry Kelly, and 2 other prisoners were admitted to the circle. Unknown to the staff, each was armed with a small pistol, which had been smuggled into the prison by the IRA. How this was achieved has never been revealed. From here, they called for the bumper, used for polishing the floor, to be brought to the circle. This acted as the signal for the escape procedure to begin. Story and another prisoner drew their guns on the officers in the staff tea room, while Jerry Kelly pointed his gun through the grille at the officer on duty in the control room. Spreading out like waves from the circle, prisoners positioned in the airlocks to the wings held up the guards manning them with screwdrivers, and on the wings themselves the same was repeated. The staff were taken to the block's classrooms, where the prisoners stripped them, changed into their uniforms, and tied them up. The prisoners had taken complete control of H7 in just 20 minutes, and no alarm had been raised. Half an hour later, a food lorry arrived in the block forecourt. Prisoners who had made themselves available for work in the kitchen had learned that this lorry served the entire maze complex and was often used by staff for jobs outside the prison, like moving their furniture. As such, there would be nothing strange about it driving out of the prison's main gate in the middle of the day. The driver was shown maps of the maze that had been smuggled in and told what route to take. The 38 escaping prisoners loaded onto the back of the lorry, all except for Jerry Kelly, who lay on the floor of the cab with a gun pointed at the driver's stomach, and off they went. At the segment gate and the administration gate, the driver was recognised and waved through without even a search, and at the main gate he stopped as ordered while 10 prisoners tried to take control of the gate lodge. This was achieved easily, but a delay in the initial arrival of the food lorry meant that they had reached the main gate during a shift change. Unaware that anything was wrong, incoming staff entering the gate lodge were held at gunpoint, but they soon outnumbered the prisoners there and attempted to overpower them. As the fight spilled out of the gate lodge, a guard driving by noticed that something was wrong and lodged his car in the main gate to stop the lorry from driving out. It was now every man for himself. The prisoners jumped out of the lorry and hijacked cars or tried to get away on foot. 19 of the prisoners were quickly rearrested and returned to the maze, but at the end of a year, the other 19 were still missing. Some returned to paramilitary activity and were killed, while others escaped the country. Jerry Kelly and Brendan McFarlane were arrested in the Netherlands in 1986, and Kevin Barry Art spent 9 years at large before being arrested in California in 1992. Many of the escapees were never rearrested, and 2 of them were never heard from again. During the fight at the gatehouse, Officer James Ferris was stabbed in the side with a screwdriver. This caused him to suffer a heart attack, from which he later died. Though it hadn't gone perfectly to plan, the escape was a massive propaganda coup for the IRA. Even British politicians, many of whom had fought in the Second World War, compared it to Allied escapes from Colditz. The escape itself and the inability to account for half of the prisoners greatly embarrassed the British government, and an official report revealed understaffing, security flaws, and procedural failures at what was supposed to be the most secure prison in Europe. Many of the watchtowers were unmanned, and the soldier in the tower over the main gate didn't intervene because he thought the escape was a fight between prison officers. In the aftermath of the escape, a number of structural and procedural changes were made to the blocks, especially the control room. The entrance was moved to outside the circle so it couldn't be negated so quickly in future, and prison access to sensitive areas was curtailed. In 1990, journalist Peter Taylor was given unprecedented access to the maze and its prisoners for his documentary Enemies Within. By now, life on the blocks was relatively quiet and routine. The airlock between the wings was left open for most of the day. The IRA's tuckshop officer ordered how many tea bags prisoners were to buy for their shared supply, and bookshelves full of Tolstoy and Hardy lined the walls of their cells. In C Wing of H8, Taylor's crew filmed a march by Loyalists to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne, which they had planned for over 4 months. They made banners and uniforms from scrap paper and empty toilet rolls, and they were allowed to do so by block staff on the condition they handed over the regalia afterwards. The march came as a big surprise to senior prison staff and the Northern Ireland office, however. Such activities were not allowed, and they were shocked into silence when shown the footage by Taylor. Further concessions were extended to prisoners after both the IRA and an umbrella group representing several Loyalist factions announced ceasefires in 1994. Prison cells were left unlocked for 24 hours a day, and prisoners were given additional money to spend, but staff felt undermined and argued that low discipline would lead to trouble. Drug-fueled raves were said to occur every Saturday evening in some blocks, and Loyalist leader Johnny Mad Dog Adair was caught trying to smuggle a puppy onto his wing. In March 1995, when prison officers tried to confiscate a bag of narcotics, over 150 members of the Ulster Volunteer Force rioted for 10 hours in H1, eventually getting onto the roof. The relaxed prison regime and chronic understaffing led to a number of other security breaches. In March of 1997, a cell full of dirt was discovered in an IRA wing on H7, along with a tunnel fitted with electric lights. It had breached the block's perimeter wall and was just 80 feet short of the external wall. In December of the same year, an IRA prisoner serving a life sentence for murder walked out of the maze dressed as a woman, mixing with prisoners' families who had attended a Christmas party. Days later, on the 27th of December, 3 INLA prisoners in H6 climbed onto the roof of A Wing, dropped down onto the forecourt, and shot dead LVF leader Billy Wright, who was sitting in a van waiting to be taken to the visitation room. Allegations were made that British authorities had colluded with the INLA because of Wright's opposition to the burgeoning peace process. The Maze prison was a major focal point of the talks around bringing the Troubles to an end. It housed some of the most influential and important Republican and Loyalist leaders whose support for the peace process would be essential. The men held there were considered by their organisations to be prisoners of war, and their release was a key demand as part of any settlement. In January of 1998, the Ulster Defence Association prisoners there voted to withdraw their support for the peace process. In a massive political gamble, Mo Mowlam, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, met with Johnny Adair, Michael Stone, and other leaders of the major Loyalist factions in the Maze, following which they reversed their decision. In April, a delegation from the African National Council, including Cyril Ramaphosa, addressed 150 IRA prisoners at the Maze, and the discussions held afterwards convinced many holdouts to support the peace process. 18 IRA prisoners from the Maze were given temporary release to attend the 1998 Sinn Féin Ardèche, where a motion was passed supporting the Good Friday Agreement. Though it was an integral part of the peace process and essential for bringing the Troubles to an end, the early release of prisoners caused considerable anger and distress in the communities they had attacked. UVF Deputy Commander Dennis McLean was released after serving just 10 of the 420-year sentence he had been given for multiple counts of murder. Pat McGee, who had bombed the Conservative Party conference in 1984, and Michael Stone, who had attacked a funeral in a bid to kill the Sinn Féin leadership, both walked out of the Maze to resume their lives, hailed by their supporters as soldiers and heroes. On the 30th of September 2000, the last 4 prisoners housed throughout the blocks were transferred, and Her Majesty's Prison Maze shut its doors for the last time. Since its closure, there have been numerous discussions on what should be done with the prison. Some want to see it preserved as a museum, especially the hospital block where the 1981 hunger strikers died, but others fear that it would become a Republican shrine. Numerous proposals have been put forward, but most of the complex has been demolished. Today, only H6 and a few administration buildings remain. Since 2013, the site has been the home of the Balmoral Show, with horse riding and cattle judging taking place in an arena built on the foundations of H2. The Maze and the dramatic events that happened within its walls continue to impact the lives of the people of Northern Ireland. Prisoners once housed in its cells now sit in the devolved Parliament in Stormont and on local councils. Their stories are told on the big screen or on the walls of their communities, and the interest generated from these drive a new industry known as struggle tourism. The unique conditions experienced by those who tried to teach and learn the Irish language in the H-blocks gave rise to a new style, often referred to as Gaeilge. Ex-prisoners became motivated teachers after their release, and its distinct differences from standard Irish have taken root in the Belfast Jailtacht. Words which first appeared on the walls of cells during the Dirty Protest now feature in the works of a new generation of artists too young to remember the conflict that created them. Whatever the future holds, the influence of Her Majesty's prison maze will continue to be felt long after the last of its walls have crumbled. As you can imagine, in trying to deal with a building that stood at the heart of the Troubles for over 24 years, there was a lot that I wasn't able to cover in this episode. I'll post some links in the description below to resources on the maze and the wider Troubles, but I would greatly recommend that you check out the Prison's Memory Archive, especially the tour and interview with John Hetherington, who worked in the maze as a prison officer. He gives a fair and complex image of what life was like on the wings for the prisoners and the staff, free from bluff or bluster. He also tells some incredible stories about the events that he witnessed. With tensions running high, John was the only officer who showed up for duty on the night that many of the 1983 escapees were returned to their wing. There will be another video going out which takes a closer look at the maze, but if you would like to wander around yourself and you have a copy of Prison Architect, I have put a save file up on the Steam Workshop. Link is in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe to be kept up to date with new content. There will be more coming on the Troubles and other aspects of Irish history soon. Thank you for joining me on this episode, and I'll talk to you again in future.